Welcome to Big City, Small Town, the weekly podcast all about San Antonio and the people who make it go and grow. I'm your host, Bob Rivard. This week's guest is UTSA's Dr. Bryan Gervais. He's an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and Geography. And the reason he is with us today, he's the inaugural director of the UTSA Center for Public Opinion Research, the new poll launched in advance of the national elections. His areas of specialization are political communication and political psychology. I'm feeling the need for a lot of both right now this week after the November election, Dr. Gervais. And I hope I can call you Bryan here at Big City, Small Town.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Well, I admire your French-Canadian name, like Rivard. I know we both share similar roots north of the border.
Right.
And I'd like you to just start, Bryan, by telling our listeners a little bit about yourself, both personally and professionally, and how you came to be where you are.
Well, you're right. I originally grew up in New England, and my grandparents were French-Canadian, Quebecois, and spoke a little French. I understand, just like yours. I do not speak very good French at all, unfortunately. It hasn't moved on to the subsequent generations. But I grew up in New England. I grew up in Connecticut, which is where my grandparents settled after moving down from Quebec in an old mill town. I didn't grow up in the mill town, but my father did. And I grew up right outside of New Haven, Connecticut, in a little town called Hamden, which is home to Quinnipiac University, which folks might recognize as being home to the Quinnipiac poll, which is a very popular national poll.
And respected.
So maybe some of my interest in polling stem from that. It's a little bit of hometown pride. I attended the University of Massachusetts for my undergraduate, and I went on to University of Maryland to get my PhD in government and politics, and had a chance to live within the Beltway a little bit and live in Washington, D.C. and experience the culture of the federal government and D.C. politics a little bit. And so that was really rewarding.
When did you come to San Antonio and UTSA?
2013, I took the job at UTSA in 2013, and I was very excited about it. My wife and I, we were newly married at the time, and we were thinking about where we wanted to be. We were very much attracted to San Antonio and UTSA. San Antonio, growing, vibrant city that had a lot to offer, and UTSA was a growing university that seemed to be expanding and on the up and up. And someone who, I'm very interested in building things and seeing things develop over time. I think the opportunity to be a part of UTSA and its growth and contribute in any way I could was very attractive.
Well, your story is actually a very familiar one here because people don't necessarily appreciate that we're one of the fastest growing universities, not just in the state, but the country. And many universities aren't growing. In fact, they're shrinking. And so there's been a tremendous influx of talent to San Antonio over the recent years. And I can say myself as a political science major at UTSA long before you arrived, I can see the caliber of faculty has vastly improved over the last decade or so.
It's certainly an exciting time at the university with the upcoming merger and expansion and all the development of downtown with the new buildings. And so, I think the university has a bright future and excited to be a part of it.
We're not going to delve into this very deeply today, but you just mentioned, quote, the merger, which ought to be capital M, because UTSA and UT Health San Antonio are going to merge under the UTSA president, Taylor Amy, in 2025. I don't think anybody really understands or has a grasp of how that's going to occur and what it'll look like when it's finished. But it's something we here on the podcast we're going to devote a lot of attention to in the future as we get into the new year.
Yeah. I wish I had insight into what to expect there. I imagine there will be some reorganization have faith in President Amy and his team in seeing it through.
Well, tell us a little bit more about the Center for Public Opinion Research and how that came about. You've had some very high-profile work in the last year leading up to the election, and I expect that will continue into our mayor's race in 2025. But it must have been quite a long time in the planning before you actually were able to launch that center?
It was a multi-year effort. It took a long time. I think we probably started having conversations in 2020, 2021, and it really did take 2 years to get established. We got established formally in the fall of 2023, and we finally had a little bit of funding to operate at the start of this year. Is really January or February where we really had some funding to work. So we jumped into it right away. Once we were formally established and once we had a little bit of funding, our first goal was to get a pilot poll in before Super Tuesday, ahead of Super Tuesday. And we did. We got a poll in late February, early March, which was our first pilot. And that was a great opportunity for us to really test out some of our sampling methodology, some of our approaches. It worked well. And then we had 3 more polls throughout 2024, one in June, one in September, and then one in October. And we just finished a 4th poll, actually, that occurred during early voting and closed right before Election Day. And we're just starting to look over those results. And we have a little bit of analysis done, but I hope we'll have a full report out soon that shows the full results there. And they're really fascinating. They're very interesting. I think they give us a lot of insight into what happened in Bexar County and San Antonio during the election.
And soon would mean later this month or maybe early December?
Later this month. So we're taking our time a little bit more than we have with our other survey reports. We want this to be sort of a longer report that goes in a little bit more in depth, has a little bit more analysis than some of the survey briefs we've released, because this one's a little bit different than what we've previously done.
Well, as you look back at the work that you published in 2024 from the 4 surveys in the market, do you feel good or not so good about what the results showed at that moment in time versus what the ultimate results were?
I'm very happy with especially our October poll results, which we released. We just look at our predictions for the outcomes of some of the various races, and they were pretty spot on. One thing that we caught was a change between September and October with support for Kamala Harris among local voters. We saw it tightening up. I think in our September poll among San Antonio voters, it was about 18. She had an 18, 19-point lead, which is similar to what Joe Biden had in 2020. Ultimately, he won Bexar County by 20 points or 18 points or so. And then in our October poll, among San Antonio voters, we saw that tighten up a lot. We saw her only leading by about 13 points. And I think there's some skepticism that it was going to be that close locally, but we see the final results in Bexar County, and Harris, didn't even win by 10. It was like 9.5 points. Now, our October polls are just San Antonio voters. Harris is weaker among non-San Antonio voters who live in Bexar County, and so that there's a little bit of a difference there. It's comparing apples and oranges a little bit, but we definitely saw it tighten up there. That was something, our data picked up on, that this was not going to be a replay of 2020, not even 2016. I mean, this is the closest we've seen presidential results in Bexar County since 2012, when Barack Obama won by, I think, 5 points over Mitt Romney that year. The other thing that we picked up on was that Colin Allred was surging among local voters between September and October, and our October poll suggested that he might run ahead of Harris, or at least win by a greater extent, which he did. I mean, our poll suggested he would win by about 17 points locally, and in Bexar County, he won by about 16.5. So we really nailed, I think, the support for Allred versus Cruz in our October poll. And in some of the November results, which we'll release soon, we're also spot on a few things.
Yeah, I would expect, Bryan, that the November results are going to show a continuation of that decline in support for Harris that you picked up from September to October. And of course, October was the advent, mid-October, late October, the 21st, I think, of early voting.
Yeah.
And I think that just continued, and that was reflected in her 9-point margin over Trump, which is not much of a margin and nowhere near enough to overcome everything happening in the suburbs and rural counties.
Yeah. And so, we see a trend between our June, September, and October polls where it's very close when Joe Biden is still on the ballot in June. We see a surge in support for Harris in our September poll coming after the Democratic National Convention, and then it tightened up as we got closer and closer to Election Day. And so, I think those polling results make a lot of sense.
Well, there's two issues. Both are getting a lot of national attention in terms of the post-election analysis, and that I really think we want to take a deep dive into here in Bexar County and really all of South Texas. The first one is how Hispanic votes changed dramatically from voting for Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump, but you started to see a trend.
Yeah.
And then Joe Biden over Donald Trump, and the trend increased. And then there was just an astonishing change in the Hispanic vote overall.
Yeah.
And how many went for Trump over Harris. And the other trend that I think I saw is most people thought the election was about inflation in the economy, immigration, and Roe versus Wade.
Yeah.
And what I heard one commentator say yesterday, body autonomy, for women turned out not to be a decisive measure of how women voted in this election, or turned out, in fact.
Yeah. So, regarding that latter point, in our November poll, which we haven't released yet, we asked folks about what they thought was the most important issue, at least locally, in Bexar County. And this is something, we aim to do over time, is sort of track this. And abortion, bodily autonomy was not one of the most important issues that we see. It was things like immigration, crime, and economic concerns, at least among local voters. So I think, there's probably some truth to that point. Regarding the broader trends here, and I'll put my political science hat on for a second. We hear the R word, realignment, thrown around a lot. And, we have seen trends among groups sort of shifting during the so-called Trump era. I think we have to be careful before we, conclude that a realignment has occurred.
You're talking about whether working class voters have now gone from Democrat to Republican, or whether that's temporary.
In this sort of larger education, urban-rural divide, I wonder how much of this it depends on Trump and Trump being around and on the ballot and a part of the Republican Party. And what happens when he's off the scene? Do we see those shifts continue, right? Or are they sort of temporary? Do we see suburban voters, educated voters continue? I mean, they were less supportive of Harris than they were of Biden in 2020, but that's part of this broader realignment or supposed realignment. Do we see that sort of continue once Trump is off the scene? And I'm not sure. So I think we have to wait before we conclude that a realignment has really occurred. I do think there's probably truth to the fact that economic concerns and concerns about inflation really explain a lot of the differences between 2020 and 2024, just because we see broadly across the country, various counties, various types of communities, various types of economic conditions, just a shift rightwards towards Trump compared to 2020. And you have to think about, what do all of these different areas, geographic units, different subgroups have in common, and it's probably their experience with prices or perception of the cost of groceries, etc. So I think that's the simplest explanation, and it's one that makes a lot of sense to me. Not that other factors don't matter as well and can explain some differences in turnout and differences in outcome in various races, but I think economic concerns explains a lot of the shifts we saw between 2020 and 2024. And our data suggests that, at least to some extent, when we ask people about what their major concerns were.
Do you think voters are angrier now than they've been in the past, Bryan? And incumbency is locked down in the state of Texas, but nationally not so. And I think everybody agrees that President Biden would have lost by as much as President Harris or more had he decided to run. But we've seen nationally not just incumbency not add up to anything here for Vice President Harris. We've seen in Great Britain, we've seen in France, we've seen in Germany. We've just seen ruling coalitions everywhere evaporate as people throw out people in power and vote in sometimes people that it seems where they're making less a statement about who they want to govern than who they don't want to govern.
I think that's absolutely right. It's not ideological. It's not sort of prospective voting here. It's not folks thinking about looking at the proposals that are put forth by candidates and suggesting this is who I want to vote for. It's all retrospective. And again, we're seeing that globally, looking at the party in power, the incumbent party, folks that have been in power while in the post-COVID era, when we've seen lots of inflation, some economic stagnation, and throwing the bums out. Since 2021, 2022, we've seen that, across the world. And not just in Western world. I mean, we've seen this in Japan and elsewhere, too. I think there's a lot of credence to that theory. This is just an anti-incumbent moment. It's hangover from COVID, and the economic repercussions of COVID, which is really high inflation. That explains a lot of it. And it's not that there aren't other things happening more locally that explain particular outcomes as well. But when we look across the world and we see incumbents being thrown out, not necessarily replaced by rightward parties or leftward parties, it's just whoever happens to be in power gets booted out, then I think the economic explanation is really the best one.
Do you think promises made on the campaign trail really resonate with people and cause them to shift their votes and actually take as hard fact Trump promising to end the war in Ukraine even before he takes the oath of office? People like myself, seniors on Social Security, being told that we're no longer going to pay taxes. People in the service industry who rely on tips and gratuities being told those won't be taxed anymore. And I wonder how many of those people blindly went to the polls thinking that's the world I want and I'm going to vote for my own pocketbook. And after he gets elected, I'll see the fruits of that vote.
I think campaigns and campaign messaging matters on the margins. And we can kind of see a difference in just the outcome of some of the different races, or at least some of the different state outcomes across the country in the presidential race, where some states, Georgia, some of the Midwestern states where Harris campaigned hard, the shift towards Trump wasn't as distinct and large as it was elsewhere, which suggests that maybe some of the ground game, maybe some of the messaging that her campaign used, was sort of effective, but it doesn't really change, the general trend here, which was that voters largely were upset with the incumbent party, the party that controlled the White House, and voted them out. So it's not that I don't think that messaging, or even some of the messaging that Trump did, necessarily, had no impact or turned people off or worked and brought people into the camp. Those effects are pretty small, and I think that's consistent with a lot of what we've seen in political science research over the years. Campaign messaging, campaign effects, they can affect a small, close election, but they can't overcome, broad, shifts away from the incumbent party, like what we've seen, in this past November.
I wonder how effective your survey will be going forward, your center, Bryan, in measuring inequality.
Yeah.
And I think by any measure, the macroeconomy is thriving, particularly having come out of the depths of the pandemic. People no longer appreciate how bad things were here. Right. And when you compare us to other Western democracies, particularly in Europe, our economy is thriving at a much more robust rate. However, that falls on deaf ears for many people. The working class has seen wages fall far behind consumer prices. Our own children, millennials and Gen Zs, can't afford to buy a house, can't afford to save, face crushing university and college tuition debt.
Right.
And for them, it's not a strong economy. If anyone who's watched the stock market in the days since the election can see that the rich do get richer.
Right.
And it's been very beneficial for those with money in their pockets, but hard to see where that prosperity trickles down to a broader electorate. And I think that that's an issue that bit the Biden administration and by turn Harris very hard. And it's one that we need to pay a lot more attention to, particularly in a city like ours where the poverty rate is so high.
Yeah. I would say that understanding and measuring those sentiments is our primary goal. one thing we've been focused on is developing what we're calling our Bexar County panel, which we aim to be a representative group of folks, representative of Bexar County who do surveys for us over time. And we're working with other researchers at UTSA right now to partner to do a number of different longitudinal studies on this group as we build up this panel. So we're measuring different attitudes and opinions and issues over time. And that includes things, lots of sociological factors, including, people's sense of how they are doing financially. But it's going to be things also like health issues, where we're also going to be addressing, we're partnering with a group of researchers looking at housing affordability and trying to measure that. And that project's in its early stages. But another one we've already started working on is measuring educational attitudes and how well we think different schools are performing here and people's perspectives on local schools. We want to measure things like emergency preparedness, how prepared people are for different types of, emergencies, whether it's weather-related, et cetera. And so, certainly, people's sense of their economic well-being will be part of this. But I'm really excited to develop this panel and expand these projects because I think it's going to be a wealth of information about our populace that can inform organizations, can inform policymakers about the main concerns of voters, their perspectives, their insights, and tracking this over time really lets us know whether or not things are getting better or worse or people's perspectives are changing on these things. Developing the panel is a lot of work. It's something that we're going to be increasing our attention to and our focus on. Not, we have a little bit of break before we jump back into election polling again ahead of the municipal elections. And so right now we're working on recruiting people into our panel through multiple modes. It's a multimodal process, and it's expanding. And we're increasing 2,000, almost to 2,000 people in this panel. We want to get to about 5,000. Who enroll in the panel, and I think we'll get there. It will be some work, but I'm really looking forward to this, and I think that is going to be the main contribution of our centers, developing this panel and in giving researchers access to the views and opinions of local residents. And this is something that San Antonio and Bexar County really deserves. We look at other major cities, other major metropolitan areas, and there are centers and institutes that do this sort of stuff. I mean, one of our models was the Kinder Institute, which is housed at Rice University in Houston. And they do a number of studies on Harris County and the city of Houston, not just election polling, but looking into health concerns, looking into educational attitudes, looking into a variety of things to really understand what Harris County residents and Houstonians, the issues that they're dealing with, their opinions and perspectives. And it leads to actionable policy, by local government there. And we hope to try to replicate that here.
One of the things I've always admired about the Kinder Institute at Rice, Bryan, is their abilities to shape trends into narrative storytelling and not just statistical reports.
Yeah.
And actually, in the early days of the Rivard Report, I used to publish quite a bit of content that they created at the Kinder Institute on all kinds of urban topics of interest to our city as we were trying to enhance our own urban core and our own attraction to young professionals.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether or not the center has that same ambition here at UTSA to become a source not just of polls and trends, but to be able to produce content that policymakers and citizens and others can absorb and be better informed as they make their own decisions about the direction of the city.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, one of the reasons we're taking a bit longer to release our results from our latest November poll is that we wanted to sort of structure it in that sort of way, more of a longer report narrative sort of thing, not these brief survey reports. And so, we aren't there yet. We are certainly not the Kinder Institute by any means.
They're very well funded.
Very well funded, lots of staff, lots of resources. That's what we aspire to be, is something like that, or if not on that scale, at least larger than what we are now, and to be able to provide those sort of services and that sort of reporting and that sort of insight into what's happening within Bexar County. So it truly is a model. We've got a long way to go before we become something like that, but that's the goal, absolutely.
I want to ask you about whether or not the university leaders, the system leaders, completely share your enthusiasm for a center like this, or whether the trend in questioning the efficacy of polls that we've seen in the last 20 years in the United States causes some nervousness about whether or not the center will be able to establish its credibility. And we can just look at the polls, which were conducted for the 2024 presidential election, where there was an awful lot of attention paid to how do we get this right? Yeah. Where do we go wrong in 2020? What did we miss? And, to the very end, every reputable pollster that I'm familiar with said it was too close to call. It was just a real nail biter.
Yeah.
Now we're looking at the results. It wasn't a landslide, but Trump, garnered more than 300 electoral votes. It was a significant win. And I heard one report that said in 90% of all U.S. counties, more people voted for Trump than ever before.
Yeah.
That's significant. Pollsters I've talked to have told me about how difficult it became in their business with the elimination of landlines, by and large, and the advent of cell phones, and the ability of people to block spammers, to type in stop to political surveys, and also people just feeling that as politics got more and more toxic and partisan, they're not going to talk candidly to a stranger on a phone about why they're voting for Trump or voting against Harris.
Yeah. I'd say in general, I think the 2024 polling results were probably some of the most accurate we've had, at least in a couple of decades, probably since 2008. I think the polling miss, and you look at the national average, was probably something about 2.8 points, which actually, is within, that's not unusual. That's what we've seen, it's actually smaller than what we've seen historically. Within swing states, they were even more accurate. It was about 2.2 point miss.
There were no swing states.
Well,
the blue wall is, it's not
if
there.
You looked at those 7 swing states, though, all the averages suggested, Trump was there or leading in almost all of them at the end by a point or two. And, it more or less that turned out to be the case there. And so I think the polling results were pretty accurate. You're always there's going to be some natural error. You're going to miss by a point or two. To become that precise is really, really tough. But I think the polls overall performed pretty well. And it has to do with some methodological changing that a lot of pollsters did. And we don't have to get into the weeds there. But, one thing they did is they weighted on recalled vote, which is they weighted the sample more based on how people reported they voted in 2020, just to ensure they weren't undercounting Trump support there. And that looks like it's really early on, but that looks like it probably made a difference in having the polls really not underestimating Trump's support all that much in 2024 compared to what we saw in 2020 and in even 2016. And we can make some distinctions here between different types of polls, right? Election polling, it's a lot different than doing a broader survey research on a population. There's distinct problems. So the issue with election polling is that you're trying to sample from or develop a sample that's representative of a population that does not yet exist. We don't know what's going to look like. We don't know exactly what the electorate is going to be ahead of time, and so we have to make some assumptions and we poll accordingly. I'm actually very happy with some of our sampling model in who we pulled in. I think we had the correct mix of voters there to really get a pretty good insight into what local voters were thinking during the election. But it's a tough thing to do. With broader survey research, which is what we're talking about, sampling, or doing survey research on, let's say, Bexar County as part of our Bexar County panel. It's a different sort of problem where we know what the population looks like, right? We got census information there. We know if we're missing certain groups, if we want to, if there's certain types of people that are missing from our samples or not are participating. The problem there is reaching those people. We have no problem getting voters to partake in our election polls. It's much harder to get people who are less engaged, maybe a little bit less trusting of institutions, to join our panel and want to participate. So I think it's two different problems and it requires sort of different solutions and different approaches. But I guess the broader point here is that even if you aren't completely sure about the accuracy or precision of election polling, and I have arguments of why, I think the polls actually did pretty well in recent elections. But even if you're not convinced of that, that's different from some of the other polling we're talking about that the Kinder Institute's doing and what we want to do with our Bexar County panel as well, which is we know what the population is. We're just trying to pull those people in, and that's the tough thing, right? And it's why we rely on so many different modes to recruit people in and reach out to them, and it's why we also offer incentives, right? We compensate people for their time, for joining our panel, and for participating in our polling too.
Well, people just sat up when they heard that. And I will say you make some very fair points about the polling, and I don't disagree with you in terms of its accuracy in that regard. But talk about the panel. It's 5,000 people. It almost seems unmanageable to me. But if somebody's listening and they're interested in participating in that and they'd like to know more about the incentives, Bryan, thank you.
Yeah.
How do they proceed?
Well, we'll reach out to you, right? So the way it works with our panel is that, we do select people randomly, right? That's a scientific process. Behind it is that we randomly select people and addresses and phone numbers that we reach out with. And so there's three modes in which we recruit people through the panel. One way is through our voter polls. At the end of it, we ask voters, right, to if they would like to join our panel, and we get lots of people through those means. We have a phone banking lab, which random digit dialing, RDD polling, where we've got interviewers who call up people and recruit them that way. And we do get people who pick up and complete our polls and agree to join. And the last element that we're just starting to do, and we probably won't really pick up until the spring, is address-based sampling, where we randomly select addresses in San Antonio. We send people mailers. They'll have QR codes on it. They can scan it with their phone, and they can join our panel that way. And through those three different means or modes, we hope to recruit a pretty representative sample of Bexar County folks, so that we can develop this panel and really do a lot of cool things.
And what are the incentives?
We offer, they're called Tango gift cards, right? So if you've ever gotten a Tango gift card before, you know that you can redeem them at tons of retailers, right? Amazon, Starbucks, Walmart, whatever. You can turn it in, and wherever you want, steakhouses, whatever. And so that's the incentive. We send you a digital gift card in exchange for completing our polls for us.
Well, I want to give you and UTSA credit, the center credit, for picking up on a trend I watched very carefully, which is early in your surveying, there was widespread voter, I would say, confusion about the charter reform amendments. Yeah. Most people didn't understand them, didn't have a position. The beginners were a little bit stronger than those that supported them, but we saw a significant shift the other way as the campaigns by both the Firefighters Union and the much more better funded campaign by the pro-charter reform groups, business leaders and others settled in, and more people got behind those. And in fact, what we saw at the polls was overwhelming support for the various charter reform amendments, many of them passing in the 70th, 60th percentile, even the one, the most critical one about the future of the city manager's compensation and term limits, passed in the 50%.
Yeah,
so
low 50s.
Pretty comfortable.
Yeah, those results are some of the things I think I'm the most proud of and interested in. And the thing we're actually we explored a lot more in our November poll, and we'll have a lot more to say about that. But so in our September poll, we wanted to gauge more public opinion about these changes, and so we used descriptions of each of the 6 ballot propositions, city charter amendments, and we adopted this from local media coverage, how they were being described, and that included describing the city manager amendment as one that would remove the caps on the tenure and compensation of the city manager that were established by another proposition in 2018. And we also described, Prop E, which would raise the salaries for the mayor and the city council. I think it's $70K for the city council, $87,200 for the mayor. And we described it in that sort of way, right? It would raise the salaries. You support this, and of course, it's indexed and all of that. And we saw really low support for Prop C when we used the description, right, of removing the caps on the city manager, and pretty low support for increasing the salaries when we described it as increasing the salaries for the city council and the mayor. In October, we used the actual ballot language, and we saw big changes for 3 of the amendments, right? For 3 of the propositions, it really made no difference whether or not we used a description or the actual wording. But 3 of the amendments have made a big difference, and that included Prop C and Prop E. And the reason was because the actual ballot language for Prop C doesn't say we're going to remove the caps on the city manager. It says, should the city council be able to set the terms of compensation and length of office or something along those lines for the city manager, right? Which is a lot different. It sounds like something very different. It's a lot more ambiguous. It doesn't sound like we're removing the caps on them per se. And even with the city council and mayor salary proposition, the actual ballot language says, should we amend it so that we set and limit the salaries of the city council and mayor to $70K and $87,200 or whatever it was. And set and limit sounds a lot different than, raising, increasing. And what we've learned is that lots of people didn't recognize that set and limit actually meant an increase. I don't think many folks knew that, how little, people on the city council and even the mayor are compensated, right? This is a relatively new thing. They even were paying them, $40 or whatever.
$20.
Yeah, right. I mean that was a recent change, and so people didn't pick up on that or understand that, and we saw that this actual wording seemed to make a difference between our September and October polls. So in our November poll, we actually did a really neat thing where we randomly assigned people to either see the actual wording or the descriptions, because we really wanted to see, okay, was this just a trend towards increased support for these things, or was it really just the difference in question wording and how we describe them? And we saw the same sort of thing, same differences we saw in support between a September and October poll. We saw between the actual wording versus the descriptions, where Prop C had a lot more support when we used the actual wording, of really low support when we used the descriptions. Same thing with Prop E, the salary, city council mayor salary, more support when we use the actual wording versus the descriptions. And ultimately, I think both our November poll and the October poll, which just used the actual wording, when we look at the actual wording, the margins by which each of the amendments passed, we were very, very close to predicting the margins by which all these would pass when we used the actual wording there. So I think we were really good at getting a very representative sample, and we were only off by a little bit for each of them. I got a chart here I want to show you, but I mean, these are the margins, the actual versus our polling results. We are very close.
I'll attest to our audience that you guys got this right.
Yeah, we're very close to predicting the actual margins when we use the actual wording. So the broader issue here, and this is a small d democratic theory issues. What does it mean when people pass ballot propositions but don't seem to quite understand what the ballot propositions would do, and when there's a disconnect there? Is that democracy in action? Does it reflect the will of the people? And I think these are the sort of questions that some of our polling we aim to raise, and I think that's distinct from saying whether or not these are good or bad things. Whether or not these policies are good things or bad things. It's a distinct question to say, okay, well, is this what the public wanted? And what does it mean when they pass things but don't quite understand or didn't understand the implications of those propositions? So those are I think those are important questions to raise. I don't think we have great answers, but it's the type of things we want to explore. And that's the sort of thing we'll be talking about in the eventual report that comes out in our from our November results. And the other thing that will be interesting that we want to showcase is the people in our November poll were people from our Bexar County panel. They're people we recruited in. And so we already know how they previously supported each of these propositions. And so we can see, okay, people who previously saw the descriptions but now see the actual wording, do we see changes in their level of support? So there's a lot of interesting things we'll include in that report that show that how much the different wording actually mattered here.
How much weight do you put to the fact that that voters here and almost everywhere sent a very strong message of no confidence to national leaders in office, and yet locally, I would say that the significantly strong passage of all the charter amendments suggests quite a bit of faith in City Hall.
I think this is an area where we should all be optimistic and should be a point of city pride. It's not just the passage of the ballot measures. I mean, in our polling, we have consistently seen higher trust for local officials and local government relative to state leaders and national government. We've seen people more optimistic about the direction of the local city and the county versus the state and the country. We've seen higher approval ratings for local officials relative to state officials and national leaders. I mean, Mayor Nuremberg had the highest approval of any official we've asked about, and Judge Sakai had very low disapproval. He doesn't have the name recognition that Mayor Nuremberg does, but not many people disapprove of the job he's doing, and it's a lot different than what we saw for Governor Abbott and President Biden, right, where people not very happy locally with the job they're doing. And I think that is something that's really important to focus on, because it tells us that our politics haven't been completely nationalized. Some of the polarization and distrust people have towards national politics hasn't necessarily seeped down locally, that people do make a distinction between different levels of government, and do recognize that what's happening locally isn't the same thing as what's happening at the state level or the national level. And I think that's something worth protecting and building upon. I mean, look, trust in local government could even be better. And when I point to the disconnect that our polling suggests between people's understanding of the different propositions, is that sort of trust is the sort of thing that we want to ensure gets protected too, right? We want to make sure people understand ballot propositions, and that they don't believe they're being tricked by sort of ambiguous or abstract language here. This is something that's worth protecting and growing, as people sense that people locally or local officials aren't trying to trick them or aren't trying to.
Do you really think, though, that local officials were trying to trick voters?
No.
I would suggest that, the ballot language has to be, the charter is a legal document, and legalese is a necessary element in all of those charter reforms to make sure there aren't unintended consequences down the road for.
I don't think so, and I don't want to imply that. But what I do think is important to ensure that people understand what they're voting on. I think that's essential to maintaining that sort of trust and approval in local officials and local government, that people you don't get a sense, oh, wait a minute, I had no idea that's what I was voting for. I didn't know what that meant, right? We need to ensure that people understand what they're voting for if we want to protect that sort of trust and approval of what's going on at the local level.
I would argue people have a certain personal responsibility to educate themselves as citizens, but that people will probably call me an old fuddy-duddy for saying that. We're running out of time, Bryan. I have one quick question to ask you about going forward, and that's the mayor's race. The surveys clearly showed that people were not focusing on that at a time. They were looking at national and state politics and elections. I don't think anybody had 10% approval. How many surveys will you do, say, between January 1st, the new year, and the May vote for the mayor and city council, or will you be checking that regularly, or can we expect one or two?
We're thinking about 2 to 3. Okay. I think we would do at least 2. The results are going to look a lot different, right? Because our sample was a very, we're trying to sample a very different electorate, right? In our fall
A much
polls.
smaller one.
Right. It's going to be a lot different. So, our model, how we sample changes because we're focused on very different types of voters. These are high propensity voters, not just super high propensity voters, right, who turn out in municipal elections. I mean, to share the percentage of registered voters, we're lucky if we get to 10%, right, turnout in municipal elections. And so it's going to be a very different approach. So lots of the folks that say don't know or never heard of the candidates, that's going to shrink, right, once we change up our sampling methodology just to focus on the municipal polling. We want a little bit of a benchmark and just sort of understand, where the public felt about the municipal elections ahead of time. But it's going to be a very different sampling approach, different methodology. I shouldn't say it's a different methodology, but the people will bring in, it's obviously going to be a different set of people than the people we bring in for the presidential elections.
Well, we must have you back before May, and we'll look at those survey results and what they're predicting or telling us. And I just want to thank you, Dr. Bryan Gervais, Director of UTSA's Center for Public Opinion Research, for coming on to Big City, Small Town today.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun.